So thank you all very much for coming again this afternoon to continue this very important and interesting conference on everyday lives of instability in the global South. Do I need the loudspeaker or I do need it? Okay. I always think my voice is so loud from having screamed so much at my kids, but I guess not. Okay, so so the panel that we have before us is Gender, Resilience, and Reflections. And just very quick introduction. My name is Firoozeh Kashani-Sabet. I know it's a mouthful. I'm a history professor who teaches Middle East history at the University of Pennsylvania. And I really just want to say a huge thank you to all the organizers of the conference for this wonderful event. I also want to say a huge thank you to the Department of Africana Studies and the Center of Africana Studies for including me at a time, as a secondary member of the faculty at a time when things were very difficult for me on this campus. And so I have a sense of tremendous gratitude to have found a home here. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to say that and to say thank you. So we'll begin with we have three panels, we have three speakers on this panel. We'll begin with Professor Camille Carr, who I'm
not a professor, but PhD.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Professor in the making. Professor in the making, Camille Carr, who actually has told me this is her first year at Penn.
Right. In the program. Like
in the program. And I'm going to get it right by the end, which is very different for me because I've been here 26 years. So I feel like I'm surrounded by youthful energy and optimism, which we all could use, nowadays, especially here and other campuses. And the topic of her talk is the politics of Viche, Black women's placemaking and political legibility in the Colombian Pacific.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Well, while we get the slides pulled up, I'll share. So the following paper is the culmination of a 3-month ethnographic fieldwork that I completed in the Colombian Pacific in Cali, which is the capital of the Valle del Cauca department. This is actually the political section of my master's thesis. And I've titled it The Politics of Viche, Black Women's Placemaking and Political Legibility in the Colombian Pacific. Tyron, do I just press this one? Oh, okay. So I'd like to start. Down. Is the down? Yeah. There we go. Okay. Okay. So I'd like to begin with a vignette. The artist pours the transparent Viche into my outstretched, cupped hands. She instructs, before you touch the elements of the altar, you must cleanse your hands and your senses. Breathe in the Viche, let it flood your nostrils. Feel the absorption of the Viche into your hands, into your body. The artist pours the Viche on the floor, preparing the site for the altar we are going to construct together. Now that the Viche has entered your body, move with intention. Place the elements where you feel called to put them, and thank them for allowing you to commune with them. With Viche-soaked hands, I place a red cloth imprinted with the words, Vamos pueblo carajo, in bold, commanding Black letters in the center of the floor. Directly behind the red cloth, I place a wax candle that emanates cleansing notes of rosemary and a bundle of lavender sprigs held together by a humble brown twine. Meanwhile, the artist spreads out a long, thin bolt of orange fabric and begins to place clear glass bottles of Viche Curao. Some bottles are roped in fabric, others are kept unveiled. Accompanying each bottle is a wooden totuma, the traditional receptacle for drinking Viche. She tells me that Viche is a spiritual entity, an autonomous body within and of itself, and that one must always drink it with pensiveness and purpose. Viche is a living spirit that we embody and inhabit. Our bodies are vessels for its knowledge. Nearing the end of our collective fashioning of the altar, the artist places the remaining elements, Polaroid pictures of her family, clusters of golden chrysanthemums that still retain their vibrant saffron hue, and a cigar for the beginning and end of life, a legua. The artist lights her candles and begins to sing, Amor bichero, vení a curarme bonito, vení, vení. Métete en mis sueños, limpia mis llantos, vení, vení. My bichero love, come to cure me sweetly, come, come. Enter my dreams, cleanse my sorrows, come, come. With those opening notes of song, we begin our communion with each other, with the orishas, and with our Viche. This is an illustration from the artist who I'll speak about more later, and then this is a picture of the altar in, more broad view with the cloth in the middle. This vignette recounts a ritual performance by an artist in Bichera named Mayra Arboleda Mina, from whom I learned much about the archival praxis and matrilineal tradition of Viche. Viche is an ancestral distillate of sugarcane and an original conception of enslaved African women in the Colombian Pacific who cultivated the drink from their environment and preserved its unique recipes. Utilizing oral traditions and holistic methodologies, Bicheras imparted embodied knowledge to their descendants, ensuring the survival of their heritage for posterity. The cultivation of Viche thus constitutes a uniquely matrilineal praxis. The production of Viche endured for generations along the periphery of the Colombian nation state, despite concerted institutional efforts to suppress and eliminate its existence. Throughout the Pacific region, the Colombian state deployed police forces called tenencias or resguardos de rentas to confiscate Viche. Black Pacific Bicheras, which I forgot to mention that Bicheras it means producers of Viche, circumvented a generations-long state prohibition by employing clandestine measures like concealing both their reserves of Viche and the means of their production to escape detection from the police. Thus, the continuation of Viche making composed a spatialized act of survival through which Black women communed with their environment. Insulated within the dense autonomous topography of the Pacific littoral coastlands, Bicheras communed with the sugarcane stalks that bore their Viche, the forests from which they gathered herbs, plants, and spices, the rivers down which they navigated their canoes, the lumber that fed the fires for its distillation processes, and the very earth where they buried canecas or earthenware bottles of Viche in the dirt to keep them hidden from the state. Rather than yield to nation-state suppression of their ancestral traditions, Black women Bicheras tapped into a foregoing spirit of defiance and autonomy, a stronghold from the period of enslavement, to preserve their traditional practices. Presently, Bicheras enact and defend the autonomy of their cultural, economic, and archival constructions through the production and commercialization of Viche. Now, the production of Viche was a clandestine archive until its legalization on November 8th, 2021. The political project to legalize the commercialization of Viche culminated in the number 2158 Ley del Viche, or Law of Viche, which designated Viche as the patrimonial drink of the Colombian Black Pacific, affording Black Pacific Bicheras the legal and intellectual protections to pursue their own markets of Viche distribution. The law purported to end the de jure repression of Viche throughout Colombia, defined Viche as only those derivatives of sugarcane originating from the Pacific region, so the denomination of origin, and confirmed that only those members from Black Pacific Bichera communities could adopt the title of Bichero or Bichera. But unfortunately, as we've seen, as Viche and its involved processes entered the realm of official state legibility, the original constitution of its praxis consequently became obscured as white Colombian entrepreneurs established and promoted their own brands of Viche. So there are a multitude of brands of Viche that showcase intentionally curated imagery and colloquial phrases evocative of the Black Colombian Pacific, which are in fact owned and managed by people who do not originate from the Black Pacific. These brands have found commercial success and widespread social media attention, not only in Cali, but also in the metropolitan strongholds of Medellin and Bogota. That gentrifying and culturally appropriative forces emerged amidst the nascent network of Viche commercialization is neither an unprecedented nor particularly surprising development. As Kai Johnson contends, cultural appropriation is colonialism at the scale of the dancing body or the sacred ritual object, its life and dynamism reduced to a thing for consumption. And so I ask, in the face of co-optation and exploitation, how do Black Pacific Bicheras protect the life and dynamism of Viche? In bringing Viche forth for consumption and ensuing official legibility from the Colombian government, the law of Viche obfuscated and endangered the production of Viche by bringing it into direct conversation with structures of racial hegemony. Many Vicheras and Vicheros do not believe that the protections extended through the legislation are sufficient to safeguard their craft from exploitation. A widely held sentiment is that the law of Viche opens the door for anyone to belong to the Viche commercialization process, facilitating the entrance of white Colombian entrepreneurs who appropriate the production, modify the drink from its ancestral dynamics, and destroy the autonomy of Black Pacific Vicheras and their communities. And so from this precarity, from this discrepancy emerges what I term a politics of Viche, a response to the official political project for legalizing Viche and its misstep in protecting Black Pacific Vicheras and their communities. Pitkin defines politics as activities through which relatively large and permanent groups of people determine what they will collectively do, settle how they will live together, and decide their future. Thus, a politics of Viche is a collective undertaking on the part of Vichera communities and their allies of activisms and principles that refuse hegemonic structures of control and suppression, and revindicate the autonomy of Vicheras to determine the legibility and future of their traditional practices. The scope of a politics of Viche is as follows. It entails the recognition of Viche as a Black matrilineal technology with provenance from the Colombian Pacific, a recognition of Vicheras as political actors who advocate for the cultural and economic autonomy of their communities, the promotion of pedagogical interventions that teach about Viche from the perspective of those who hold the tradición Vichera or the Vichera tradition, promotion and support of artists who create works about Viche, and most importantly, purchase of Viche directly from Black producers in the Pacific. And so I ask, what does a politics of Viche entail and endeavor to achieve within the context of the Colombian nation state? What are the implications of introducing the production of Viche as an embodied and expressive ritual praxis into the formal realm of politics? And then to which circumventive paths do Black women turn to advance that original project for recognition of their community's political strivings, cultural expressions, and archival praxis? There's not nearly enough time to get into my sort of intellectual genealogy, but I wanted to lift four scholars who are extremely important for my work. I began with Argentine-Mexican philosopher Enrique Dussel and his theory of exterioridad, or exteriority, which accounts for the manners in which subjugated peripheral cultures contest the encroachment of modernity and negotiate the legibility of their traditions in an ever-developing, increasingly multicultural world. The Colombian Pacific represents such a peripheral region that developed outside, but adjacent to modern Colombian nation-state formation. And then I have Afro-Colombian decolonial feminist scholar Betty Ruth Lozano Lerma, who expands upon Dussel's exterioridad with her theory of the lugar de la no existencia, or the place of non-existence from which Black Pacific women must enact everyday insurgencies to assert their presence. Lozano's scholarship provides an important foundation for understanding the strategies of placemaking and resistance that Black women have employed since the time of Colombia as a nation. I hold Lozano's work in close relation to Catherine McKittrick's writing on Black women's geographies and placemaking, and then of course Tiana Peischel and her work Becoming Black Political Subjects. In the Q&A, I'd love to get into, the sort of 20th century anti-alcohol legislation that established the prohibition on Viche, but I'll jump ahead to, here, I'll go back 2 slides. So I locate the legal precedent for the law of Viche in 2 pieces of legislation that signified the broadening of cultural and territorial rights for Afro-Colombian citizens, the 1991 Colombian Constitution and the 1993 Law of Black Communities, also known as Ley 70 or Law 70. So Peischel in Becoming Black Political Subjects elucidates the political processes that ushered Black Colombian people into the folds of the Colombian political and national imaginary. The 1991 Colombian Constitution recognized that Afro-Colombians were a distinct ethnic group whose right to collective territory was to be legally protected. And then we see that with Ley 70 or Law 70's recognition of collective territory, it was the largest agrarian reform in Colombia's history in 1993. Peischel contends that the aforementioned pieces of legislation thoroughly unsettled the ways in which Colombians conceive their nation, a conceptualization deeply rooted in the myth of racial mestizaje and homogeneity. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. So we see that within this recognition of the 1991 Constitution and Ley 70, we also see that there was an ambiguity of Blackness and Black people in the Colombian national imaginary that was also reinforced. And then when we're talking about the law in and of itself, Pychelle notes that there existed and exists a notorious gap between the laws on paper and then actual state practices, right? Calling this letra muerta or dead law. For instance, 20 years after the passage of Ley 70, only 2 of the law's 5 substantive chapters have even been realized by the state. Pychelle argues that despite the fact that Colombia has one of the most advanced legal systems in the world, the rule of law continues to fall short. And so that's the discrepancy that I'm looking at, right? My work does not intend to advance an argument that Black Pacific Bichera community should not have pursued legislation, right? The legislation behind the Ley Viche was brought forth by bicheras and legal advocates, right? But rather I'm exploring the nuances of the discrepancies between the verbiage of the legalese, its application, and its varying consequences, the varying consequences of codifying the production of Viche into the Colombian national record, particularly because these consequences are directly harming Black Pacific women. During the Q&A, I'd also love to talk about an interview that I had with a white entrepreneur who had his own brand of Viche, and he was very concerned with like cultivating his image and how I would speak about him in my thesis. But essentially, when we're talking about the Ley del Viche and the discrepancy, one of my interlocutors, Alex Almeri Portal, terms what's happening commercial colonization, right? Because now that people are able to go to the Pacific and buy Viche wholesale, they'll buy, let's say, they'll purchase a gallon of Viche for 100,000 Colombian pesos, which is like $25 US, and then they'll turn around and market a single bottle of Viche for 70,000 Colombian pesos, which is $17 US. So if they're selling 25 bottles of Viche, then they're making a profit of 1.75 million Colombian pesos, which is $425 US, earning 15 to 16 times what they originally paid for it, right? They're traveling to the Pacific, buying this Viche, taking it back to Bogota and Medellin, creating these brands, and then going to market it in Miami, right? And saying, this is how you can make Viche at home. And none of this is getting back to the actual communities, right? And so to go back to my original sort of lifting up of a politics of Viche, this sort of informal response to the discrepancies that are occurring. Here I have pictures of one of my interlocutors on Viche. It's just, they're beautiful. This previous one, or here, I'll show this one. The one in the back is the transparent Viche. That's the prima materia. That's like the thing that comes directly out from the distillation chute. And then it's infused with herbs and plants and roots. And then we just have the most amazing, beautiful colors. But essentially, and lifting up the politics of Viche, I really want to turn to the words of some of my interlocutors who are just the most generous and gracious people in sharing their knowledge with me. First, we have Nidia Gongora, who is a Grammy Award musician. She's the lead singer of Canalone Timbiki, if anyone's familiar with that band. And I remember when I moved to Cali, coincidentally, I ended up living in the neighborhood where she had her restaurant. And I went there and I was like, hello, my name's Camille. I'm a researcher from the United States. I want to talk to Nidia. And her niece who was working was like, she's in Kenya with Francia Marquez on a government initiative. Like, this woman is like the big deal. And I said, that's okay. And then I ate lunch at that restaurant every Sunday for 2 months. And then one day her niece messaged me on WhatsApp and she said, Nidia's here at the restaurant, like come over and you can speak to her. And I did, and it was amazing. Essentially what we were speaking about was a derivative of Viche that is used in traditional midwifery practices. It's used to ensure the reproductive health of women. And so it's called toma seca, and it's just really incredible just to see a drink that was made, by Black women, for Black women and their health. In my thesis, it was a bilingual thesis because I did my master's in Latin American Studies. And so I'm grateful that I was able to submit it as such and have the text be completely in Spanish from their interviews. And then I included the English translations in the footnotes for those who needed them. But essentially, I'll just lift Nidia's quote. She says, we are knowers, bearers of tradition, women who come from a Vichera tradition, who have known it since they were little. My mom is knowledgeable. She is a midwife of the community. She's a singer, but she's also a woman who from a very young age also learned everything that has to do with issues related to Viche within cultural, medicinal, and ancestral scenarios. My next interlocutor that I want to highlight is Ana del Pilar Copete Alvarez. She is the director of the Petronio Alvarez Music Festival, which is an amazing cultural arts scene that happens every August. And from 2008 to 2021, it was the only venue where bicheras and bicheros could come and sell their biche without fear of retaliation from the police. So a very important venue, and she is the granddaughter of Petronio Alvarez, the musician for whom it's named. And so there are a lot of pedagogical initiatives at the festival itself. There's like a round table with bicheras every day of the festival, which is 5 days, where they come, and there's a term, comadreo. It's like a space of comadreo where women are just speaking with women, right? And so she says, our pedagogical mission is to generate a process of awareness at the national level about the recognition of the Afros in the construction of the country and what this recognition implies. That the rest of Colombia sees us, the Afros of the Pacific, as equals, right? That we are recognized and that in our difference, we are respected and that we have a clear dignity in our lives. And then lastly, we have Mayra, who is the artist, and that was her altar at the beginning and her illustrations at the beginning, and this is her with her biche. With Mayra, I really wanted to talk a lot with her about extractivism, about the law, and about white entrepreneurs who are able to market outwards, right? And she, calls it for what it is. She calls it extractivism. I agree. She says, the people from bichera communities, the majority of them will not be able to export their biche. Sure, there might be 2 or 3 producers who you can bet on raising the capital, but usually the people who are going to obtain capital are white and mestiza people, and they're the ones who end up benefiting from a drink that has historically and decisively belonged to Black communities. And so holding all of this, I ask if the production, or I assert, if the production of biche undergoes processes of mass market globalization and exportation, it will inherently lose the provenance and dynamic processes that make it an ancestral, artisanal, matrilineal Black Colombian drink. I ask what will happen to Black Pacific bichera communities when biche becomes a global phenomenon like some want it to be? Will they fade once more into the periphery? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that fascinating, really beautiful presentation. I'm sure not only me, we all learned so much. So thank you very, very much. And I hope we can have more conversations about it as we open up the panel. It's now my distinct pleasure to welcome Professor Scholar. I figure that's a good way to go, Helen Bizune from the University of Pennsylvania as well. And the title of her presentation is Let Ethiopia March Ahead with Her Beauties, the Making of a Modern Nation at the 1968 Miss Addis Ababa Beauty Contest. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you, Camille, for your beautiful presentation. And thank you for all the organizers who organized this wonderful conference. I'm delighted to be here. And yeah, as was said, I'll be discussing how a beauty contest that took place in 1968 in Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa, served as a platform for contest organizers to portray Ethiopia as a nation that could elegantly straddle the line between modernity and tradition as understood by the organizers and emperor. And so this balance, I will show, functioned as a response to the Ethiopian public's conflicting attitudes towards the idea of holding a beauty contest in their nation. And I importantly situate this contest within the broader context of rising discontent towards the empire among student activists. And so this photo that I have up on the screen is of the winner of the 1968 contest, Wosene Hailu, on the left, and she is shaking hands with Emperor Haile Selassie. And so I think this photo pretty much encapsulates what I'll be getting into today. And so you can keep this photo on your mind as I switch to other slides. On October 12th, 1967, English-language Ethiopian newspaper, the Ethiopian Herald, published an article formally announcing the Haile Selassie Theater's plans for the Miss Addis Ababa 1968 beauty contest, the 4th formal beauty contest held in Addis Ababa. The beauty contest had been sporadically held since 1955, and the last contest, which was held in 1964, was won by Misrak Alamayo, who's featured right here in this image on the right in the center article. By the time of that 1964 contest, the maintenance of the beauty contest was in jeopardy. According to a report in the Herald, there were a total of 48 registrants for the 1964 contest, compared to a total of 69 the previous year. This number only continued to dwindle when the Haile Selassie Theater attempted to hold a contest in 1967, but garnered only 18 registrants. So the contest was postponed until the contest organizers could garner enough participation, ultimately rescheduling the contest to the eve of Ethiopian Christmas in 1968. The dramatic decrease in participation in beauty contests between the years of 1964 to 67, for me, invites a key question. Why were registration rates dwindling? And how did contest organizers repopularize the contest enough to the point that the 1968 contest not only had a dramatically higher number of registrants, but also a packed audience of more than 1,500 attendees? Within a Herald article that detailed the postponement of the 1967 contest, Kabada Asfaw, who was the head of the Haile Selassie Theater and chief organizer of the contest, detailed his interpretation of the many possible reasons for the dwindling participation. One of them was his perception that many Ethiopian women, quote, felt that the general public in this country was not ready to accept a beauty contest at its face value, and that they, quote, feel that too many taboos are attached to the whole business. When taking a look at other articles featured in the Herald and Addis Zaman, which is an Amharic language Ethiopian newspaper, it becomes evident that the understanding of beauty contests as a cultural taboo seems to factor largely in the dwindling participation. Evidently, many Ethiopians feared that beauty contests, being a foreign phenomenon that presented female beauty in a way that didn't align with Ethiopian expectations for feminine modesty, could effectively degrade long-held Ethiopian traditions and disrupt Ethiopia's cherished and hard-won cultural sovereignty. And in fact, only 27 years prior, Ethiopia was liberated from Italy's 5-year occupation. Being a nation known for its unique status of never having been formally colonized, those 5 years showed many Ethiopians that they could not take their sovereignty for granted. So this popular anxiety surrounding beauty contests in Ethiopia was only one example of popular concern for the foreignization of Ethiopia during this period. Emperor Haile Selassie was known for his desire to modernize Ethiopia, which frequently meant introducing Western European and American institutions and styles to the nation, such as forms of education and architecture. At the time, the observed modernization of Ethiopian women or foreignization of Ethiopian women seemed to be of particular concern among traditionalists. The phenomenon of the miniskirt, introduction of foreign beautification practices, and the showcasing of women's beauty on a foreign-sourced platform, such as a beauty contest, for many signaled the debasement of traditional feminine modesty, and therefore the dreaded foreignization of Ethiopia itself. And so right here, I have some examples of this. This is an ad for skin lightening treatment in the newspaper. This is another ad for a soap. Just thinking about the kinds of ads for beautification that are in these newspapers, and some articles that detail this sort of discourse around the miniskirt, these debates around the miniskirt. And so I ask, what was it that made Emperor Haile Selassie and others who supported the presence of beauty contests in Ethiopia so invested in the practice, convinced that its impacts may indeed be national and even international in scale? How could they rationalize beauty contests to critics who considered the practice a slap to the face of Ethiopia's cherished sovereignty? So this reality of anxiety surrounding the presence of beauty contests in Ethiopia clarifies our reading of the ways in which contest organizers advertised the 1968 contest. So now coming back and taking a closer look at this article, we see an explicit emphasis on how Ethiopian tradition is embedded within the beauty contest practice. And it's important to emphasize that this is a constructed idea of Ethiopian tradition, right? An idea that homogenizes the nation in hopes of producing a sense of national unity at a time when there was actually a rise in opposition to the empire. There was a lot of discontent within the empire. And so we see this sort of emphasis in the title, which is geared to traditions. We also see in a quote from Dr. Manasseh Haile, who was the chairman of the contest judging committee. And in this quote, he notes that, quote, Ethiopia is famous throughout the world for the beauty and grace of its women. In staging this pageant, we are paying our respects to one of the glories of the empire, our beautiful women. And so in this appeal to Ethiopia's already existing global reputation for its beautiful women, we must remember the kind of women the nation had been famous for. Women from the northern region of Ethiopia, women who had features that many outside of the nation saw as distanced from stereotypes of African phenotype. In seeing this appeal to the glories of the empire, we must remember the women, the people in Ethiopia who have been fashioned as the embodiment of the nation's shame, obscured from view. I also ask, what does it mean for Dr. Manasseh to seemingly figure this international reputation as part of Ethiopia's tradition, as evidence that this sort of appreciation for Ethiopian beauty is nothing new? This is tradition. And so he continued in his quote saying that beauty will not only be skin deep in selecting Miss Addis Ababa, all the aspects by which the ideal Ethiopian woman is traditionally judged will be taken into consideration. And so even in this sentence, we get a subtle reference to the issue of skin color, but a quick rejection of any possibility that skin color will be a decisive factor in who wins the contest. And again, we see a reference to an impossibly homogeneous Ethiopian tradition for assessing the ideal Ethiopian woman. So I ask, whose standards are these? The contest organizers' reframing of the beauty contest as part of Ethiopian tradition draws attention to the larger stakes they had in this particular contest. When Ethiopia was liberated from Italian occupation in 1937, Haile Selassie declared the beginning of the Addis Zaman, which was Ethiopia's new age. Ethiopia's global reputation was in need of amelioration, and Haile Selassie, known for his aspirations to modernize Ethiopia, was keen on intensifying this work, especially after Ethiopia's sovereignty was put in serious jeopardy. And so I want to again emphasize that this was a period of growing discontent towards the empire, which further explains this attempt at this urgency for presenting a unified portrayal of Ethiopia. And so in 1960, for example, while Haile Selassie was visiting Brazil, his imperial guard forces staged an unsuccessful coup, hoping to disintegrate the empire's feudal system in support of the nation's peasantry and end the empire's collaboration with US imperialism. A radicalized Marxist student group was beginning to emerge during this period as well. And so from 1961 on, Eritrean separatists were also struggling for independence from the empire, further underscoring the fragility of the empire at the time. Okay. As is evident in newspaper articles that feature the comments of Haile Selassie and members of the beauty contest organizing committee, organizers saw great potential in the ability of beauty contests to present Ethiopia as a modern nation that could stand among international giants like the United States. They saw a beauty contest's potential to internationalize Ethiopia. For example, evident in Haile Selassie's declaration that, quote, beauty contests will make Ethiopia even better known, which he said during a celebratory reception that was held a few days after this contest at his palace, the Jubilee Palace. And this was further emphasized by organizers' extremely positive reactions to the unexpected appearance of then US Vice President Hubert Humphrey at the 1968 contest. And so he happened to be in town. They invited him over and they were like, oh, this is a perfect moment to have US Vice President crown our beauty contest winner. And so they invited him up. And from what I read in the newspapers, the organizers were ecstatic about this. The audience in general seemed ecstatic about it. And while I say this, I am asking everyone to remember that last slide and that reality of growing discontent towards the Ethiopian Empire's alliance with the US among student activists at the time. So, yeah. However, through every step of the contest, organizers were sure to carefully walk the line between modernity and tradition, showing critics that beauty contests were not entirely foreign in nature. And so I think this is clear, for example, in Kabira Asfau's opening speech at the contest. And in this speech, he evidently attempts to pacify critics by acknowledging that though beauty contests do not bear, quote, a direct picture of past practices, they are, quote, no doubt expressive of the highest ideals and a pride to the nation as a whole. And so in seeking public support of the contest through such means, the organizers sought not only to show the international world Ethiopia's capacity to stand among the global order of modern nations, but also sought to demonstrate the foreign world's inability to entirely penetrate Ethiopian society and culture. And so this was figured as an especially important goal given Ethiopia's recent liberation from Italian rule. Ethiopia's sovereignty in reality was in an incredibly fragile state. And this is further underlined when we remember that it's only a few years later, in 1974, when the Ethiopian Empire falls to the revolution. So contest organizers also aimed to internationalize a particular perception of Ethiopian beauty, right? They communicated an understanding of beauty as being a signal of civilization. Through their constant comments on their understanding of Ethiopians as an exceptionally beautiful people and their accompanying conceptualization of a traditional Ethiopian phenotypic appearance, they evinced their desire to portray Ethiopia as having always already been civilized. But they also communicated a sense of Ethiopian exceptionality informed by European racialized perceptions of Ethiopia that most abundantly emerged after the nation's successful resistance against Italy's initial attempt at conquest in 1896. And so after the Battle of Ottawa in 1896, European social Darwinists had this Black Caucasian rhetoric. They started calling Ethiopians Black Caucasians because they could not possibly conceive of African people or Black people resisting conquest. And so they created this new racial category for the nation. And so the influence of this discourse, I argue, shaped the idea that the exceptionality of Ethiopians can be read in their distinct physical appearance of having K skin, which is a sort of like light brown skin, a narrow nose, and long curly hair, even though not everyone in Ethiopia looks like that. Again, think back to Dr. Manasse's comments on Ethiopian women being the glory of the empire. I'm asking, what kind of women is he referring to? An investment in this rhetoric is hinted at in one Herald article that stated that though, quote, complexions covered hues from fair to dark and, quote, facial characteristics were equally varied, the classic Ethiopian features of first place winner Wosene Hailu and finalist Sarah Mandefro were considered the most beautiful by most observers. And so this communicated the idea that there is a normative Ethiopian appearance represented by the first place winner. And looking at images of Wosene Hailu, who's featured right here on the screen, we get a sense of how this imagined normative appearance may have been influenced by this Black Caucasian rhetoric that depicted Ethiopians as visibly un-African. And so their portrayal of Ethiopian beauty then sought to not only depict Ethiopia as modern, but also sought to further emphasize the ways in which an appreciation of beauty was already a tradition in Ethiopia, appealing to critics who feared the destruction of Ethiopia's sovereignty. And this is clear, for example, in Herald editor Tegenya Yetashawork's article, which he published a day after the contest. And in this quote, he says, "The public testimony of approval shown by the vast audience at the Miss Addis Ababa contest last night comes as no surprise to those familiar with the customs of the nation and the traditional honor accorded beautiful women." And the organizers' understanding of beauty's modernizing power also, however, involved their expectation that Miss Addis Ababa pursue modern education abroad, while still remaining patriotic and aiding in the maintenance of Ethiopian tradition. So what I'm getting from this is that phenotypic beauty had to be accompanied by a delicate balance between foreign-sourced intellect and nationalist commitment. At the end of chief organizer Kabira Asfau's opening speech at the contest, he uttered words that perfectly encapsulated the organizing committee and Emperor Haile Selassie's perceptions of the contest's great potential for Ethiopia. He said, quote, "Let Ethiopia march ahead with her beauties." The contest clearly served a purpose larger than what could be contained within the walls of the Haile Selassie Theater. Organizers intended the contest to quite literally push Ethiopia forward, helping craft Ethiopia's internationally facing image as a grand modern nation that was amazingly able to cling onto its long-held distinct traditions. Instead of seeing this phrase as an expression of confidence in the capacity of beauty to move the Ethiopian empire forward, I asked, what would it mean to read it differently? As a sort of prayer or as a plea for the empire's vitality, considering the ongoing protests at the time. And so before I end, I just want to, I want to know that the fact that beauty served this major role counteracts masculinist histories of Haile Selassie's modernization of Ethiopia. And while the contestants may have not had control over the dominant narratives that circulated this beauty contest, their participation in the contest and the central role they served in the organizers' nation-making project demonstrates how the manipulation and disciplining of the Ethiopian woman's image was pivotal during this period of modernization. Ethiopian beauty not only mattered to the empire, but was a grave and consequential space for a racialized project of nation-making in the anxiety-inducing aftermath of Italian occupation. And so as I continue to develop this work, I hope for next steps to explore the contestants' own stakes in this contest, right? Which is very important. Where were these contestants coming from? What importance did they see in themselves participating in the contest? And so I just want to end by saying that I take a great deal of inspiration from Dr. Elizabeth Georgis's 2019 book, Modernist Art in Ethiopia, which I strongly recommend if anyone hasn't read it. And in that book, Georgis deconstructs the ways in which romanticized accounts of Ethiopia, never having been colonized, have turned away from the clear modes of coloniality operating in the nation. So she says, quote, in the book, "The romance of Ethiopia has yet to address the fundamental terms of our present disorder, the hypothesis, logic, and predicament of the coloniality of our non-colonized land." And that's Elizabeth Georgis. And so, yeah, thank you all. I want to say thank you to Ato Fantahaun Turna, who helped me at the Library of Congress, East African Newspapers, Dr. Heather Williams for helping me develop this paper in a class last semester, Dr. Tracy Ann Wint, and Dr. Pablo Jose Lopez Oro, who helped me at Smith College. Thank you all.
Thank you for another really fascinating and relevant paper and topic that I look forward to discussing in our discussion period. So our next presenter is going to be online, and it is Professor Rai Kena Feraz de Cunha de Sousa Teixeira from the Universidade Federal de Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And the title of her talk is "The Dirty Mark of Experience, Heloisa Teixeira's Critical Response to Cultural Instability in Impreciosas de Viahem." I apologize for mispronunciation. Thank you.
Hello. Now I open my camera. Good afternoon. My name is Camille. I am Brazilian. I study at Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, and I made a 15-minute presentation, and I knew I wasn't going to be in an ideal set. I am gonna take a flight in 2 hours. I'm in the airport. So I made like this presentation that I decided to make as simple as I could for you guys to know some Brazilian intellectuals that you may or may not heard of. And also simple as my English can like get to you because it's not my native language. So I will start to present my screen. And if you can't hear me, please let me know that I will try to speak more loudly.
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you, yeah.
Okay. I can see you, so I don't know how my screen is.
Yeah, we see your slides as well. We can see them.
So the title of my communication is The Dark Mark of Experience, a associated critical response to cultural stability in impressões de viagem. Impressões de viagem is the title of her PhD thesis that became a book in 1980, and I translated very loosely as Impressions of a Journey. And this book is my thesis object. I study her PhD thesis work because I think that it's a very early cultural studies body of work in a time that cultural studies wasn't being thought about. So I will read the topic, and the book was made in the second half of the 70s and published in 1980. The book analyzes the poetry scene of the 60s and the 70s of Brazilian poetry, and is concerned with the variables of what political engagement would be for these artistic productions that were so different between the 60s and the 70s. So Eloisa, she decides to research her sociability in Brazil. She was a teacher of literature and the UPenn in the university, and she wanted to see how political engagement changed between the 60s and the 70s regarding contemporary poetry. Elisa's driving question at the time was her desire to understand why the university as a critical parameter and the publishing market as a commercial parameter didn't allow themselves to be absorbed by the marginal poetry that, for her, was the most vital production in the contemporary poetry to make this panoramic. Sorry?
No, it's okay now.
So the book makes this panoramic showing about the 60s and the 70s, and she wants like to investigate why in the 60s the poetry was very political engaged in a sense, like the lexicons, the shows of the themes, and while the 70s, these political themes were not so literal, but it was very political in the sense of behavior.
To understand why the university as a critical parameter and the publishing market as a commercial parameter did not allow themselves to be absorbed as a by the marginal poetry that for her was the most vital production in the contemporary poetry at the time. So the university wasn't being willing to study this poetry that was made on the streets and was made by mimeographed. I don't know if like in a cheap way of copying and distribution. The university didn't want to study that, and the market didn't want to publish that poetry because they felt it wasn't poetry, and she started to question that. I brought the thesis synopsis, like this is the original thesis that was uh, given to the library, written in Portuguese, and after I translated a literatura enquanto intervenção no debate cultural brasileiro de 1962 a 1978. A poesia populista identificada com as manifestações de vanguarda na perspectiva revolucionária. A crítica anárquica do tropicalismo e de seus desdobramentos, a opção alternativa e vitalícia da poesia marginal. So, literature as an intervention in Brazilian cultural debate from 1962 to 1978, the day that the thesis was written. Populist poetry identified with avant-garde manifestations from a revolutionary perspective. The anarchic critique of tropicalism and its consequences, and the alternative and vitalist option of marginal poetry. So just to explain, there are three main tendencies that she studies on her book about Brazilian culture. But the most interesting thing for me on her thesis, and it's what I study in my PhD research, is how she made a methodological innovation in the 1970s and in the scientific way of writing and researching in a time that it wasn't allowed or not even allowed, it just didn't exist because extraterritorialism was so the main way of doing science and the humanities. So I brought excerpt. I brought excerpt from Impressões de Viagem, is the introduction of her book, and I will. This is a translation by my niece, so maybe there are some translations mistakes. Paths, objectives, and explanations. This takes risks of working with culture in process. Although this causes difficulties in the sense of the lack of a more defined historical perspective, it does, on the other hand, bring the tempting possibility of a critical role in the unfolding of this process itself. Another risk taken, and perhaps the most seductive, lies in the extreme proximity of the analysis to its object, which, if on the one hand hinders a certain critical impartiality, on the other enriches it by the very dirty mark of the experience lived. Since the investigation of this debate is the investigation of the foundations of my own intellectual journey. In other words, of the sequence of contradictions and detours that made up the theoretical possibility of this work. Both the title, Impressions of a Journey, and at various times, the option for accepting the form of the narrative, which is more suited to the narrator than the analyst, take this side. So her thesis was made in first person. I don't know if this makes sense in English, but she wrote her thesis in a very different methodological way, and it was very controversial at the time because she decided to make it obvious that the object that she was studying was also herself, her sociability, and the literary world. And for to enclosure, some conclusions. Eloisa's academic work is deviant from the norm because it makes a self-critical reference to its enunciation, because of the awareness of its locus of discourse. Eloisa Teixeira critical activity, therefore, will have as a characteristic from its very beginning the will to stir up what is political in the cultural branches of a given reality, of a given context. The quote about the difficulty of critical impartiality is not just a caveat. Self-critic here will be part of the research methodology. At a time when the use of the universal voice as the goal to be achieved by the discourse and the role of the serious intellectual. The choice of self-criticism will not be a deviant attitude, but a risky one. And this is a quote of Eloisa when she was asked in an interview about her thesis. And she said, my doctoral thesis, for example, almost failed because I assumed the first person in the argumentation and in interpretation of the poetic material I was researching. From then on, I discovered the radically first person essayistic form in which I felt and feel comfortable exposing my work. So this this is Heloísa Teixeira, and she is a very important intellectual in Brazil, and at the same time, not very known because in our branch of study in literature, we have this very Marxist male canon that we are formed by. So I got to know her when I got to Rio de Janeiro, where she gave classes, and I felt like it was very interesting her beginnings, like because she got very known after in the 90s. She was already known because of her name. It's very important this change of her name because she was called Heloísa Buarque de Holanda. That surname, Buarque de Holanda, it's a very traditional surname here in Brazil. Like a lot of artists have this surname, a lot of very important intellectuals. And in 2023, 2 years ago, she decided to change her last name to her grandmother's lineage name, Teixeira. And like she's I want to say is like she was very known in the 70s and the 80s, but she became like this important intellectual when cultural studies had this, I don't know if fame, but when it became really important to think about transversality in the studies. So her works before the 90s, it's not very studied. And I wanted to study this her beginnings, how she was, how she did make her point of view work in the 70s. And I found that the seed, the seed of a perspective that wants to look about the object, but at the same time to look at herself because she knows that a researcher, a scientific researcher, cannot look about object without looking at itself. It was already there in this work in her beginnings. I hope you could understand and you could like get to know this intellectual, Brazilian intellectual. She died last week, literally last week. I went to the funeral and everything. She was like the tenth, only the tenth woman to participate in our Academy of Brazilian Letters. I don't know if this translation works for you, but it seems like a different time coming in a sense that university and institutions are trying to be more, I don't know, I don't speak in Portuguese, but more open to marginal marginal stories. And I really think that she, Heloísa Teixeira, here in Brazil is a big responsible for it. I'm so sorry about the noises, and I really hope you could understand something. Thank you. I I also want to thank you to thank the organization, especially Gayatri, Dr. Gayatri, because she talked to me along the way. I tried to travel to Pennsylvania to be there, but it was impossible. And I want to really thank you, all the organization, and say to my colleagues, Helen and Camille, that I loved your presentations. And I really think that Viche and cachaça are very similar. Do you know cachaça?
They are, yeah, they are very similar. They taste
Yeah.
really similar to.
Yeah.
They're both sugar liquors. Although I'm interested to know if cachaça is like explicitly Afro-descendant or if it's like Afro-descendant and indigenous. That would be interesting if anyone in the audience can elucidate.
I don't know. And I wanted to ask if Viche is like you said something about orishas, but I didn't really heard very well. But I was curious if Viche, if there is some ritual, like religious ritual, specific for Viches, for Viche. Did you
Yeah.
understand what I'm saying?
No, yeah, absolutely. And that's a really beautiful question. I think from what I have observed so far is that it is certainly always present in ritual spaces. I am not like a religious studies scholar. From what I've seen, though, perhaps there aren't as strongly documented sort of como espiritismo or like Santeria in Cuba or like in the Dominican Republic. I haven't observed that extremely strong documented lineage in Colombia. I think in the Pacific coast, it's a lot of like Afro-Catholicism, and so beach is present at rituals. They're called balsadas, where you have like the statue of the Virgin Mary, Christ child. They're on these wooden rafts, and we all float down the river. We're all drinking Viche on the way down. Certainly present in Afro rituals, but I think that people who have tapped into these descendant religions certainly commune with their orishas through and with Viche. So like the performance artist, this was her sort of ritual performance that she enacts as a pedagogical initiative, but it certainly wasn't like a specific, espiritismo tradition around Viche, if that makes sense, that I've observed so far.
Great. So thank you all so much for three really fascinating papers that give us really different perspectives on the role of women in the global South within their own communities in the process of both colonialism and decolonization. And one of the things that I was struck by across the board, all three papers, was the different ways in which women's voices are still being silenced through processes of statehood, ways in which politics, in your case, also commercialization, the economics of a new type of colonialism, as you point out, like the colonialism of commercialization, I think was the term you used.
Commercial colonization.
Oh, good, commercial colonization. I knew it was in that general vicinity. And so I found that to be really interesting. For Helen's paper, I also thought what was just really stood out for me was how similar this process also was in the Middle East. So, for example, in Turkey in the interwar period, Turkey was all big about these Miss Universe pageant, but one thing that I wanted to, I guess, learn a little bit more about in the case of the Ethiopian beauty contest was how much of the sort of the disinclination to participate had to do with the fact that women were afraid of their reputations. So in the case of Turkey, it was, people thought they couldn't, like their daughters couldn't get married because they would be, like not considered good wives or good daughter, you know what I mean? Like somehow their reputation might have become tarnished through participation in that. And in our last paper, again, I just love this idea of sort of marginal poetry, because in so many sort of global South cultures and contexts, women poets, in fact, are those marginal voices, and a lot of them do experience what you also have documented in the case of Eloisa is that it's hard for them to get published. It's hard for them to be a part of, or sort of a part of a moment in a nation, and to be a part of the corpus of mainstream literature, shall we say. And so I found that to be really interesting. But above all, I guess I was just, I mean, for me, the unifying theme, and I hope you can all speak to it a little bit if you don't mind, is how women's voices still get silenced in these sometimes patriarchal, but not only patriarchal. So there are racial sort of limitations on impositions, and restrictions on what women can do, but also how this gets played out in commercial spheres and sort of familial spaces, and also in national ones. So thank you all so much for 3 really fascinating, but in a way, really complementary papers on this panel.
Are we opening up for questions from the audience?
Yes, I think maybe guys, we have time for you guys to sort of address this, and then we'll open it up. We have about 15 minutes after that. So if y'all want to take a stab at it.
Yeah, I can try taking a stab at it. I guess.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Yeah, thank you for your points. I think this point about women's voice, how women's voices get silenced even in a beauty contest that is, raising women on a platform is, really important, because as I was looking through the newspapers, you see all of the most of the organizers of the contests are men. The ones who seem the most invested in this, at least in organizing this, are men, and it's important to consider why that is. And but also important to, I'm interested in looking further at more archival materials to consider what the women's stakes were in the contests, because, they could have varying stakes. Some could be, some could have been equally invested in this sort of nationalist project that was being pushed by the empire and the organizers of the contest, and some may have not been, some may have had participated for other reasons. So I think it's important to start to look for that in the archive and try to see if I can find more about that. In terms of like women, why women may have been more reluctant to participate, I think this question that you're raising about reputation is an important one too, because it seems that, at least from what I've seen so far, like there was this sort of fear that participating in a beauty contest could ruin a woman's reputation as a modest woman, I would say, more so in terms of how a Ethiopian woman is traditionally expected to behave. And so, I think that is really important information to pursue, and I'm excited to find more about that. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for your question about silence. I think one of the main sort of themes, if you want to call it that I'm lifting up in my work is like clandestinity, like the fact that Viche necessarily had to be a clandestine archive, and that clandestinity or that silence was not necessarily a bad thing. And so I think that silence, if we're talking about how women's voices are silenced, more so about how women are using silence as their own maneuver to sort of like turn that on its head a little bit, right? But with talking about patriarchy, it's really interesting. Something really beautiful that I found in my work so far is that, of course, as I mentioned earlier, with like the conventions of Spanish language, there are bicheros and bicheras, right? There are men who produce biche, right? The sons, nephews, whomever of women in these very long lineages who have passed down, and all of the sort of bichero interlocutors that I had this summer, it was all like very clear, right? This is an honoring of the women who have forged this tradition for us. And so I think that more so when I'm looking at silence in my work, I'm looking at the need for clandestinity in some cases. And then also looking at like invisibility within hypervisibility and how that happens. And there's a scholar at the University of Oregon, her name is Maria Fernanda Escadron, and she wrote a book called Becoming Cultural Heritage, and she's looking at Palenque, which is on the Caribbean coast, which I would say, like, if we're talking about like the Colombian national imaginary from outside Colombia looking, and I think a lot of people might be familiar with Palenque. There's, it's San Basilio de Palenque was one of the first sort of like maroon settlements established on the Caribbean coast.
back in the, I guess that would be the 1600s, 1700s. And and, there's a very particular dress. And in 2005, UNESCO determined Palenque to be this cultural heritage site. So people flock to Cartagena and they go to Palenque. But within this hypervisibility of Palenquera women, there is still all of the things, right? Like economic precarity, like violence, invisibility. And so really that's how I think about the silencing of it all.
Yeah, I just, if I, and then I'll pass it on also, to Raya. I think, just to be fair, I think there is a distinction between, active, clandestine, sort of silencing versus, what you were describing later in your paper, which is, lack of agency and a kind of silencing because they have no control over the product being sold, for example. And sort of not being able to reap the rewards of it. I think so. So, yeah, I think that's kind of what I was trying to make that distinction between having a voice and an agency in the process and then not having it as well, at some point.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think I just tried to enact very active language, the state is threatening the autonomy, not they do not have autonomy.
Yes,
that makes sense?
absolutely, yeah.
Okay, yeah, great.
Rai, would you like to?
Hi. I just noticed that they are seeing me like with this big head. I'm so sorry. Like I was trying to hurt.
You look great.
Yeah. So about silence, that's something that I study in my thesis is why I am in a educational part of letters of literature. So I study why this book doesn't doesn't appear in like on the references and the basic courses in my research field because it's very 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 easy to understand this whole process, cultural process in Brazil, and a good curatorial uh, poetry is from this part of our history, and we don't get like an undergrad situation. We don't listen, we don't hear, we don't talk about this book, and I think that is because of a structure that we study only male canonic and in this specific case Marxist tradition. So like I asked for because I'm postgraduate in UFRJ in Rio de Janeiro, but my undergrad diploma is from another university in my hometown that's called Goiânia. So I took this bibliography from my course, and I'm trying to understand who made my basic formation, my basic course, and Eloisa, her work it's very good for basic courses, and she doesn't appear, and I want to know why. And I think the gender is related, like not only the gender but the strength of this university, this specific de São Paulo, my university from São Paulo that's very strong, and like not her like their courses it's spread all over the country and our research field. So yeah, I think like this is a question in my research, like why we don't study that book more, because it's very easy to understand a cultural a difficult cultural process through poetry.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you all so much for weighing in. I'd like to take this opportunity now to open it up. Yeah. So, wow, so many questions. So I'll let Gayatri lead us here.
Thank you for the beautiful presentations. I really enjoyed all. Helen in particular, that's my home country, and a few of the things that were being discussed were something that somewhere I read about as well. If you may have seen Jonas and Masus, what were they thinking about tradition and modernization in Ethiopia? He mentions few of things. So I would think this the beauty pageant that has taken place was seen as one giving agency for the woman, but again, it was taken away by, overshadowed by the men. But it is a part of the process of the country that was undergoing through, which was modernization, because to go to the palace, people were supposed to wear mourning coats, as opposed to the cassock that was naturally the background of the country or the tradition of the country, and so on and so forth. The modernization, when people were playing the traditional instrument like the Carr and the masenko being considered as undeveloped or not modern at all, whereas they were playing Western instrument that they were being considered as someone elite. So this elitization of the country process came at the intersection of the monarchy going away and the new Marxist kind of thing is coming in. So this exercise was one of the first debate that has been in the students' movement. So the student movement used this opportunity to frame that they didn't even call it Westernization, they rather called it Americanization. And so they were referring it as Yankee go home. We don't want that culture. We want Marxism. And you can relate it to the Russian Revolution or other revolutions whereby such kind of exercise was seen that way. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that comment. Do we want to go straight to other questions or should I go ahead?
I think go ahead. We'll let you go.
Okay.
The next person.
Oh, maybe, okay.
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay, 1, 2, 3.
We'll take all three, yeah. Is that all right?
All together.
Got it. Okay.
Thank you all very much. All the presentations were wonderful. I had a question for Camille. Two if I may, but I'll start with one.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, perhaps you mentioned this at the beginning of your presentation. I had to step out. But Viche is very much connected with the work of parteras and also used to treat like menstrual cramps. So there's like a deep connection with health and medicine. So I was just wondering, how do you analyze in this possible like really expansion and commercialization of Viche? How are your interlocutors, the Vicheras that you're working with? How are they talking about this? Because something that often happens is these drinks and ancestral medicines often become disassociated from their original practice. So we're just wondering if there's how they have responded to that as well. I'll ask the other question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your beautiful, beautiful papers. I just have a quick comment. Basically, it was nice. You got me thinking also about a connection to the last panel in terms of also visibility, invisibility, of formal, informal, being seen, not being seen, and also the choices, strategic choices, also of fugitivity of not being seen, remaining in the informal. Because often when we're talking about formal, informal, it's like this pure economic discussion, but there's I think there's overlaps also in terms of scales of beauty, entering the civilized, of what happens and how it gets mobilized in other ways. So that's all, but thank you for such beautiful papers and presentations.
Thank you.
Yeah, same sentiment here. Yeah, about the the presentations. I also just have a comment. It just struck me, about Helen's presentation about how, and the comment that Firoozeh made about, silencing women, how women are supposed to, in the context of beauty, pageantry, to represent the beauty of the nation, but to then shut up. I mean, so she's beautiful, but she's assumed to be dumb. So, and this, I was reminded of this, thinking about Miss Campus when I was in college, many years ago. So there is always the assumption that these girls on the stage are beautiful, but they don't know anything. I mean, they're supposed to be dumb. So they will ask them some questions, and the one that stands out in my memory. So the question was, what's AIDS? And obviously, you know, stage fright. The girl was acquired, and the whole hall, the boys were like, acquire, the sound, they just say, acquire, I. And since then, until I left college, we called girls acquire. So every girl was acquire, acquire. Because I was confused at that point that it was just stage fright. But there was an assumption that she was dumb. She didn't know the meaning of AIDS. And so, you know, so I was just struck by the whole idea of why, you know, they're supposed to represent the nation, but at the same time, you know, they don't know what constitutes the nation. They are just a mere representation. And I thought that kind of, you know, of course, I mean, when I became more literate about gender issues, I had a better understanding of that debate. It was just fun at that point that, you know, acquire thing. Anyway, so that was just a comment. Thank you.
Yes, I had a question for Helen. I was just wondering about other African countries, especially in the Horn of Africa, their responses to the modernization that was occurring. Because I even know with your example of Turkey, I mean, Iran was experiencing these same things. So there was like reaction and people were noticing these changes, especially if Eritrea specifically had a reaction, especially with their fight against colonization against Italy. So thank you.
Great.
Thank you so much for the table. I've learned so much. Camille, my question is for you. You've addressed a little bit about the clandestine archives and the institutionalization of archives, but you open your presentation with an artwork, a performance. So I don't know if you deal with that in your work, but like if you can comment a little bit about the role of art as an archive, or this reflection of what archive can art be in this context of this dual idea of archive. Thank you so much. I've learned so much from you all.
Yeah, cool. Hey, do you want to start with yours?
Sure, I'll start.
Okay, you start.
Okay, I'll start.
You start.
Okay. Thank you all so much for your questions and just comments that is just making me want to continue this research and consider new parts of it. And considering your comments, it just, first of all, I'm so excited for us to talk later more about this beauty contest and your memories of it, because another method I'm interested in is oral history, and what oral history can tell me about Ethiopians' memories of the wider context, the wider atmosphere of Addis Ababa during this period, you know, and what oral history can offer that newspapers can't necessarily offer me. And so I think it's really important to consider, and yeah, this idea of Americanization being more emphasized, considering Ethiopia's relationship with the US at the time, is also really important. And so I'm excited for us to chat more about that. And considering also this comment about women's intellect, and I think it seems it's interesting because in the newspapers, what I saw, as I touched on, is that there was this emphasis on the winners of the contest pursuing education abroad, right? And so maybe it was this sort of, maybe they were making sure that people were not thinking about this, that the beauty contest was, I don't know, making their women less intelligent or anything. And so maybe that is why they sought to emphasize this, make this emphasis on foreign education. And so I think it's an interesting consideration, and also interesting comparing it to other beauty contests in other areas. Thinking about Beauty Diplomacy, a text by Oluwakemi Balogun, and how she explores beauty contests in Nigeria, and how this is not something that's unique to Ethiopia and something that we see across many contexts. Thank you all for your comments.
Okay.
I'll start with a question about art. And I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. What's your name?
Julia.
Julia. Because it gives me a chance to talk about my t-shirt. So my t-shirt says El Viche lo cura todo, and that's actually like the first part of the title of my master's thesis, but it means El Viche, it cures everything. And it's from an artist in Cali, her name's Natalia. And I also have a poster in my office for those who've been in the office in the cubicle. This is all her. And so there's a huge like art scene surrounding Viche and artists who are creating this incredible works. And that's one of the sort of tenets of politics of Viche, if we will, to really pay attention to the artists. And this is the way that they're expressing I don't know, just the power of Viche. There's also a printing press in Cali called La Linterna that produces the most amazing posters. And right around the time of like the legalization of Viche, but also like every year around like Petronio time, they come out with like incredible posters about Viche. And I have a ton of pictures that I can show you later. That's an entire presentation. It's just like this printing press. And not just about Viche, a lot of just like social movements, a lot of talks around oh, whose presentation was it earlier? I think it was Dr. Ordoneda's about las mangas. Like I think there's a lot. Yeah, La Linterna is great, just with posters and social activism and art surrounding Viche. And now turning to the question about the parteras. Yeah, I wasn't able to dive deeply into it in this presentation, but essentially we have El Viche Puro, which is the transparent Viche. That's the first thing that, you know, is produced. And then we have two traditional derivatives. One is El Viche Cural, which is the one that's really like specialized for healing like general ailments throughout the Pacific. We have the elders who know exactly what to put into it to help with what you need. And then we have Toma Seca, which like you open a bottle of Toma Seca and the first thing you smell is cinnamon. Like that is the main sort of ingredient that's there. And that is the one, as Dr. Ordaneta mentioned, is the one that helps women with their menstrual cycles and cramps. And then during childbirth, there is a mixture, if you will, that's termed like bebedizo, that's used to like limpiar la matriz, like to cleanse the womb, and just really beautiful utilizations of Viche in childbirth. And so I'm really excited because this summer I'm going back to Colombia for ethnographic research, and there's an organization, Asociación de Parteras Unidas del Pacífico, a United Association of Midwives of the Pacific. And now that Viche is, you know, being commercialized, you know, rightfully so, they're tapping into this like eco-tourism, right? And so they have this initiative in Buenaventura, that's called La Ruta de la Partera, the route of the midwife. And they're, you know, inviting people in to see the utilizations. I mean, well, I don't know if, I'm sure it's just gonna be like a demonstration, of course, but you know, just like this is the utilization of Viche in childbirth, and then really talking about the medicinal and ancestral and spiritual components of Viche in that manner. So I'm really excited to return. And then, you know, this was my master's research, and I certainly see like for my doctoral research moving forward, a very strong focus in like Viche and Black motherhood, matrilineal knowledge production, birthing, all of those things. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you all so much. I think we should give another round of applause to our scholars for 3 really excellent papers. I think we have a little break right now. So thank you, everyone, and especially all of you.
Thank you.